Hey, welcome to PPAS 1110 for the first week after the reading break and the midterm exam. And at this point in the course, we've looked at those four big institutions that shape our regime: Western liberal capitalist democracy. And now we're going to pivot a bit and look at the institution that will most be of interest to us if we're studying public administration as a degree: bureaucracy. And of course, bureaucracy is the organizational form that almost all large organizations take in the modern world. Somebody joked that large organizations are either bureaucratic or they're dysfunctional. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. So, with no further ado, I'm going to bring up the slides and we're going to get started. So, bureaucracy, French word which literally means the rule of the office holders. And as noted, it was originally developed in French literature to describe the officials of the French court. And as with today, it wasn't used as a neutral term. It was meant to be derisive and to imply uh, somewhat of an insult. These, and if you were to kind of contrast these people in literature, they would be kind of skinny, gray, oily kind of characters who got in the way of the dignified, noble people who ought to be running France. Right? They were primarily written of as either somebody or some group that were illegitimately exercising power and usually to the disadvantage of the nation of France. Now, during the dawn of the social sciences in the 1800s, the term bureaucracy was imported into research and given a more neutral meaning. Not good, not bad, just something that is in the modern world. And it's important to note, and I think we may have mentioned it a couple times before in this class, that the social sciences really came of age alongside the emergence of our regime, Western liberal capitalist democracy. As with the Western liberal capitalist democracies, the initial examples, what we can see as an emergent social science research, is found in the 1800s as thinkers began to study the changing world around them and to apply systematic or scientific methods to their inquiries into social life. And this was a really big change because up until the 1800s, almost all research on society was philosophical in nature. What are good norms? What are good behaviors? And not judged tied to positive or negative outcomes, but to what we could call theological understandings of what was good. This begins to change slowly beginning in the 1600s, but really comes of age in the 1800s as more and more researchers begin to use the same methods of the natural sciences: systematic inquiry, observations of things that are really happening, and then systematic inquiries to try and identify causes for those things. And this really takes hold in the 1800s in Europe and North America and leads to a revolution in social science. Well, it leads to a revolution in the study of societies, the birth of the so-called social sciences. And among the early pioneers in this work in the 1800s was a German sociologist, lawyer, historian named Max Weber, who died at the beginning of the 20th century. Max Weber is famous for a number of things. Among those was his study of this new phenomenon of bureaucracies, and especially state bureaucracies, as opposed to bureaucracies in private organizations such as businesses. Now, in order to understand where Weber is coming at, you have to understand that his study of bureaucracy was tied to his much wider and more general studies of society. And in order to get around that, we really have to think of three concepts: power, domination, and authority that he used in his work, and how they lead to a fourth concept: legitimacy. Power, in its most overt sense and most observable sense, is the ability to carry out one's will despite resistance. If A can convince B to do something that B would rather not do, A has power over B. If the minister, the elected head, the elected politician who heads a ministry, if a minister can convince members of parliament to vote for a bill that the minister wants to get passed, even though the members of parliament have reservations, have concerns, if the minister can convince them to set aside their concerns and vote for their bill, the minister has demonstrated power over parliament. Domination occurs when power is organized in a hierarchy so as to increase the chances an order will be obeyed. More often than not, the prime minister does not have to cajole and convince members of parliament to vote for their legislation because a majority belong to the prime minister's party. And the party is organized in a hierarchy with the prime minister at the top and the ministers in the middle and the ordinary members of parliament who make up the majority of the political party at the bottom. Consequently, we can say not only does the prime minister have power over their political party, more often than not, the prime minister exercises domination over their political party. Authority. When obedience is based not on threats, but a belief that a command is legitimate. Justin Trudeau usually doesn't have to threaten the members of the Liberal Party to support his policy. The vast majority of the Liberal members of Parliament, the vast majority of the time, do whatever Trudeau asks them to do because he has the legitimacy of having won the party's leadership in an internal election and then led the party to two victories in two general elections. He's the boss, right? Authority is when obedience is based not on threats, but a belief that a command is legitimate. More often than not, I don't have to threaten anybody in this class in order to get you to do your work. You do it because you believe I have authority, that the commands I'm giving you are legitimate. And that's an important point. And that's the fourth thing here, legitimacy, right? The belief that someone has the right to give commands turns power and domination into authority. And this is an important point about legitimacy and authority. It is not something you as a leader or you as a person in a position of power claim. It's something that other people in the organization or in the society grant to you. The only reason the prime minister has authority is because the ordinary rank and file members of parliament who make up the Liberal Parliamentary Party, who make up the Liberal caucus, grant him authority based on their belief that he is exercising power legitimately. The only reason I have any authority in this class is because you, as participants, choose to grant it to me because you believe I am exercising it legitimately. I'm exercising power legitimately. Okay, so that's important. Authority flows from legitimacy, and legitimacy is something that other people have to grant to you. It's something they believe, so they grant you authority. Otherwise, if all you do is exercise power because people are afraid or people are worried they'll be punished, it's not authority, it's domination. Now, Weber spent a lot of time asking, where does this legitimacy that turns power into authority come from? And he argued there were three big sources. First, there's traditional authority. This is the legitimacy that people grant to leaders based on religion and folk traditions, right? Before modern times, kings were said to rule by divine right. They rule because God put them there. That's religious authority. In other pre modern societies based on clans and kinships, folk tradition designates somebody as the leader of the community or the clan. The second type of authority that Weber identified was so called charismatic authority, where legitimacy is based on the personality of the leader. And this is especially important during revolutionary times when traditional, or as we will see in the next instance, legal authority breaks down and somebody seizes control through the power of their personality, their persuasiveness. And a really good example of this from way back history is a fellow in France named Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution had destroyed completely almost all public respect for the religious and traditional roots of authority and legitimacy in French society. Attempts to replace them with legal authority had failed miserably. Right? From 1789 through to 1799, 10 years, there was chaos, there was confusion, and eventually one person, through the power of his personality, his public speaking ability, and his image, took charge. Napoleon Bonaparte, and reestablished authority through the legitimacy of something that is truly modern and really, really, really associated exclusively with the world in the modern post Renaissance area, legal, rational authority. Legitimacy is based on legal principles and following the correct procedure while giving orders. In other words, under legal rational authority, legitimacy is based on the belief that somebody has the legal right to give orders and that they've done so in accordance with the correct procedure for issuing an order of that certain type. Legal rational authority is the uniquely modern form of legitimacy, right? It's legitimacy based on a truly unique and modern concept, the rule of law. And Napoleon was smart enough to understand that while charisma is important in revolutionary times, you can't build a system based on charisma because, people get old, people get fat, people get tired. So one of Napoleon's key achievements was to develop a new system and new foundation for law in France to replace the old one that had been swept away with the French Revolution. So that as his regime developed, he was relying less on charisma and more on legal rational legitimacy. And that's very important because while someone may be fortunate enough to have charismatic authority, that charisma very rarely lasts their entire life and certainly not after their death. And we see this time and time again in failed revolutions that things go pretty well in the early days, but the leader, it doesn't age well. Think of Venezuela. Think of Zimbabwe. The revolutions that really take hold, such as the American Revolution, such as the South African Revolution, are where the charismatic leaders who leads the rebellion to power understands this and makes it priority number one to install a strong legal foundation. George Washington is remembered as the first president of the United States of America. But his real greatness was in helping to organize the Constitutional Convention that wrote the American Constitution of 1789. Prior to that, America had had a different constitution, the so called Articles of Confederation, and they hadn't worked out so well. And Washington, although he didn't draft much of the new Constitution, excuse me, not 1789, 1787, excuse me. Although Washington didn't really draft much of the new Constitution, he was essential as a charismatic figure in bringing everyone together, in helping them find compromises, and being the essential person to be the first president under the new Constitution, the person everybody agreed they could trust. And he was wise enough to know that embedding that law was far more important than him personally, which is also why he only served a limited time in office and then retired. Pretty much the playbook that was followed by Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So we have this idea of legal rational authority. People have authority because they have legitimacy under the rule of law to issue orders. They have a legal right to give an order, and they're giving it in the way the law prescribes. Legal rational authority forms the basis of bureaucracy. So with Weber, bureaucracy ceases to be a loosely described shorthand for the people who work for government. It ceases to be an insult. It now has a social theoretical explanation for the way in which power is transformed into authority, and also a more detailed description, right? And we'll get to that more detailed description in a minute. Such a description is sometimes called an ideal type. An ideal type organization is a form of organization, a kind of theoretical organization that does not perfectly exist any real world organization, but which a lot of organizations in the real world closely approximate. So, a theoretical ideal type, there probably isn't any one organization in the world that fits it 100%, but the vast majority of organizations that we claim are described by the ideal type are pretty close fits. So, what is bureaucracy as an ideal type? Weber identifies the following key properties of a bureaucracy. And of course, you will have read these in your reading from Weber for this week. The specialization of official duties, right? In a bureaucracy, people don't do everything, they have functions, right? Specific things that they specialize in doing. Past people who work verifying documents at the passport office don't do taxes. They verify information on people who apply for passports. They don't verify information on income tax returns. That's a different specialized duty. The hierarchical organization of authority, right? There's a in bureaucracies, there's a big pyramid. At the very top of the pyramid, because we're a democratic society, is an elected official who we call the minister in Canada. In other countries, they might be called secretaries. They might be directly elected members of parliament, or they might be, sorry, indirectly elected members of parliament. They might be directly elected to their jobs. In some countries, people not only vote for a government leader, but also for people who hold certain offices, like the justice minister. Sometimes they enjoy, in a democracy, an indirect mandate. They themselves might not be elected, but they were appointed by someone who was. This is the situation in the United States, where secretaries are not elected, but they're appointed by someone who is the president. So at the top, we have an elected, somebody who's accountable to the electorate in a democracy, called the minister. And then underneath them, we have some form of a senior bureaucrat, whatever they're called. In Canada, we tend to call them deputy ministers for the most part. And then under the deputy minister are the associate deputy ministers. And under the associate deputy ministers are the assistant deputy ministers. And under the assistant deputy ministers are directors general. And under directors general are directors. And under directors are bureau chiefs. And under bureau chiefs are bureau direct, and so on and so on and so on until we get to the very frontline people who serve the public or carry out duties. And authority, and with it legitimacy, flows down the pyramid from the minister who receives their mandate from the political system, the democratic system. Authority of office holders is restricted to official duties. A passport services officer has authority to issue or deny passports. When they leave the office, they're just an ordinary Canadian. They don't have the authority to stop someone in an airport and arrest them for having an invalid passport because their official duties are restricted to whether someone gets one or not enforcing border security. Officials hold office by appointment and via contractual relationship with the organization. In a bureaucracy, the reason you hold office is because you're hired to do it. It's a job. Unlike in some systems of government, where people are placed in their office for familiar or religious reasons. Officials selected based on qualification to do the job, well, that's pretty straightforward, right? It's a professional public service, and people are chosen because they know what they're doing, not because they're related to somebody or because of some mystic ritual or religious decision making structure that puts them in office. Officials pursue their office as a career, protected from arbitrary dismissal. Again, this is the professionalism aspect, right? Public servants tend to enter the bureaucracy somewhere near the bottom or the middle of the pyramid. And then as they gain experience, as they improve their education, as they demonstrate their capabilities, they rise up through the pyramid. It's a career, which doesn't mean that people will spend their entire working lives in the public service, but they do tend to spend a substantial portion. And although it is not unheard of for people to enter at the top of the public service from other careers when those are relevant to what they're doing in the bureaucracy, that's not the norm. The norm is that people enter near the bottom or the middle and they rise through it. And of course, bureaucrats shouldn't be taking bribes or shouldn't be selling favors or making money in other ways from their offices. Their job is to be public servants. They can't buy and sell their offices. Their offices are their jobs, not their property. And how bureaucrats work, and this is really important, they take abstract rules and apply them to practical cases. What does that mean? It means they take laws and regulations that are written in a general sense. This is what the law says. This is what the regulations that the cabinet has made under the laws say, right? Because there's usually two pieces or two sets of rules that bureaucrats have to apply. The first is laws. Laws are made by Parliament in Canada. Next, there are regulations. Regulations tend to fill in the details, and they're made not by Parliament, but by the executive, right? Parliament may pass a law that says, for the general interest and well being of Canada, from time to time, the Minister of Transport has authority to make regulations for the safe and efficient conduct of railways and rail transportation. So that's the law, right? Parliament has said somebody has to make sure the railways are safe. But we don't want to have to come back and make new laws every time this, that, or another minor technical detail needs to be changed. So we're going to delegate that authority to the minister. And from time to time, the minister will issue something called a regulation. And he has Parliament's or she has Parliament's authority to make those regulations, provided they are for the safe and efficient conduct of railways and rail transportation. So, for example, if they discover that a certain design of railway car is unsafe, the minister may make a regulation requiring all the railways who own railway cars that carry a certain type of freight and are were made in a certain model year to take them off the rails and depot them at their works yards and inspect them and only put them back in service after they've been inspected and the mechanics are sure that the defect that affects some of those cars isn't present. Or if it is, that they're fixed. That would be the sort of thing that would be covered by a regulation. Another thing that might be covered by a regulation is a new design standard to improve safety. or guidance about how, and this is an important thing right now, artificial intelligence computer systems are to be used by railways that wish to automate some of their operations. That would be the sort of thing that would be covered by regulations. Operations are generally conducted in writing. This is crucial for you to understand. Public administration is a written practice. Characteristic of this is the idea of a file. People don't usually in a public service talk about the issues or problems or cases they have. Instead, they ask each other, what files are you handling? Right? Because in a bureaucracy, everything is conducted by writing. When somebody applies for a passport, a file is opened. The documents are placed in the file. On the other side of the file is a checklist. On the next page is a review list where the different public servants who review everything make their notes and date it and sign it. As the file progresses through, the checklist is completed, the various authorizations are added, and then a final permission is granted, passport is issued, file is closed. And all that used to be done on paper. Now it's done on various screens on a computer. But the idea is still the same, and we still call them files. Impersonality. Bureaucrats aren't supposed to bring their personal views and preferences into things. They're supposed to judge each file by the facts that are present in it. And only the relevant facts. And as we've already talked about, the head of a bureaucratic organization within the state bureaucracy is usually someone selected according to a different set of principles. In the Western liberal capitalist democracies, that principle is democratic selection. So, like any other organizational form, the goal of bureaucracy is to balance technical and organizational efficiency, the most output with the least resources, and the best output, perhaps we could say, with accountability, ensuring rules are followed and that decisions are in keeping with the intentions of the leadership of the organization. So, another early social scientist who was a contemporary of Weber, a man called Michaels, was the first to suggest that any large organization in the modern world will ultimately become a bureaucracy. And here it's important to note that state bureaucracies, public service bureaucracies, were not the first organizations to adopt a bureaucratic form. States were not the first organizations to adopt a bureaucratic form. That honor goes to business. In the 1800s, business people encountered a problem they had never had before. They had to organize and coordinate the work of large numbers of employees who could not see one another and often could not speak to one another. because they were operating and needed to coordinate in almost instantaneous time, even though they were spread across a continent. We're talking about the railroads. And if you think about it, railways present a problem that really is unique in the early 1800s. Because in order for a railway to work, people all over the country, in the case of Canada or the United States, all over a continent, or a country like Russia, which is pretty much a continent, or think about a situation like Europe, where you have multiple countries and people who speak different languages and work for different organizations, all need to be coordinated from one side of Europe to the other. And that coordination has to happen instantaneously, or things won't work. If there is a problem with a railway in Montreal, pretty soon the trains start backing up in Halifax and in Toronto. The same is true with the industries that are the giant transnational companies that rely on the railways to ship their goods to market, right? A steel company may have a steel mill in Hamilton, but the customer for the steel may be all the way across the continent in Vancouver. And somehow the steel company has to coordinate its activities so that the customer in Vancouver gets the steel when they need it. This need to coordinate large numbers of people across large distances in almost instantaneous time led businesses to develop the bureaucratic model. So, positive features of bureaucracy are pretty straightforward. Ensures faithful execution of decisions taken higher up the hierarchy, regardless of distance in near instantaneous time. That's why it was developed. It ensures impartiality and equality of treatment. If reality closely approximates the model, whether you go into a passport office in Montreal, or you go into a passport office in Toronto, or you go into a passport office in Brampton, you will get the same decision if you present the same facts in the file. And that's important because in a Western liberal capitalist democracy, the rule of law requires everybody to be treated fairly and equally under the law. State bureaucracies and the bureaucratic model, again, if we follow it, excuse me, excuse me, if we follow it, tends to ensure a reasonable level of competency, right? Public servants generally know what they're doing and generally do it well. And it also tends to be reasonably efficient. It is an efficient way to organize the work of large numbers of people so that we reduce mistakes and we reduce lags due to miscommunication and uncoordination. Negative features of the bureaucratic ideal type: bureaucracies don't handle change well. If you think about that hierarchy and all the layers and all the people who do highly specialized tasks, you can see that it's a pretty good system if you know what needs to be done. And that was the case for much of the modern era, especially the period after World War II until about 1975, 76. We pretty much knew what government needed to do. There was a plan, people were following it. But what if you don't know what the future is going to require? What if fundamental issues are being disrupted by technological improvement and change every single day? What if the ground and the climate is literally shifting under your feet and all around you? What if government really does not know what its priorities are going to have to be in 6 months, let alone 6 years? Then bureaucracy could pose a problem because all that specialization prevents people from being rapidly reorganized and redeployed to new tasks. While efficiency is always important in bureaucracies, as we've noted, part of the reason it was adopted is because it was reasonably efficient way, right? We can get a high degree of certainty that jobs will be done by people qualified to do them. They'll be well coordinated and mistakes will be reduced. But a certain amount of efficiency that comes from innovation and creativity is kind of sacrificed in a bureaucracy so as to ensure high degrees of accountability. It is not that bureaucracies are inefficient, it's that efficiency isn't the only thing that's being sought because high amounts of accountability, ensuring that decisions conform with legal authority and and the rule of law is being respected count for just as much. Another serious problem is the power of knowledge problem. Bureaucracy, if you think about it, is a way for organizing and focusing the power of knowledge. If you think about all the different levels of the hierarchy in a bureaucracy as providing information and providing knowledge so that the power and knowledge of literally hundreds of thousands of people is concentrated in the hands of a handful of people near the top of the pyramid, you kind of get the idea. And those permanent public servants at the very top of the pyramid, just under the minister, who've spent years moving from, say, the bottom or the middle of the pyramid to the top, developing networks, developing understandings in their areas of specialty, focusing knowledge, have a tremendous advantage over the person installed to nominally lead them, the minister. They have There is an asymmetry of knowledge, and an asymmetry of knowledge means somebody has power. So the first problem of the power of knowledge is the power of the senior public servants versus the democratically accountable minister, because the senior public servants have a far greater knowledge and far greater information about the field they're working in than does the minister. The second problem is, what if this machinery for concentrating and focusing information and knowledge comes under the control of a really bad political leader? a bad government. And here I'm not talking about the sort of bad government we see from time to time in elected democracies. I'm talking about Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, totalitarian dictatorships. Right? Because bureaucracies disaggregate tasks into specialized little functions, people end up cooperating in evil without necessarily doing anything that by itself is evil. Think about the Holocaust, which was the German plan to murder millions and millions of people because of their religion, their ethnicity, or their gender, right? We're talking about gays who were also victims in the Holocaust, talking about Russians and Slavs and the Roma who were also victims of the Holocaust. And of course, we're talking about the Jews, right? I work at the Ministry of Transport and I receive an order that I need to do a purchase request to buy some new railway cars. What's wrong with that? I work at the Ministry of Railways, and I've been told that we need to develop some new marshalling yards in the vicinity of some rural areas in Eastern Europe. What's wrong with that? I work at the Ministry of Public Works, and I've been told that I need to identify suitable areas in Eastern Europe for large encampments. Those encampments should be fortified, and there needs to be rudimentary shelter for so many people plus the guards. What's wrong with that? There's a war on. I work at the Ministry of Science and Technology, and I've been told to talk to the chemical industry about efficient ways to store and manage poison gas, right? I work at the Police and Public Security Ministry. I've been told that I need to develop plans to move large numbers of urban people out of the cities via train stations. Again, what's wrong with that? It isn't until you put all those things together that you see none of these bureaucrats are doing anything that's particularly wrong. It's only when the whole plan is put together, something that none of these bureaucrats see while they're doing their planning, that you get the Holocaust. So Weber really, really was concerned that if the bureaucratic machinery he was seeing built in modern states fell into the control of an Adolf Hitler, bad stuff would happen. And it did, both in Germany and in other countries that experienced totalitarian dictatorships, like Russia under the reign of Joseph Stalin, Vietnam under the Khmer Rouge, and a few other places. Some would say we're seeing a return to that. Not sure. Anyhow, the key point is, what did Weber think? Well, Weber felt there was one sure way to prevent this, and that was to have Parliament hold the minister accountable and have Parliament elected by as wide an electorate as possible. In short, liberal democracy. Because he argued that in a liberal democracy, a bad government would not be able to continue doing evil for long. Eventually, the public would become aware of what it was doing, would become disgusted by what it was doing, and put a stop to it before it could get out of control. And that also, to a certain extent, helps explain why one of the very first things Hitler did after he took power was organize the destruction of the Reichstag, the German parliament, and declare essentially rule by the executive, essentially a state of emergency. Because with an elected parliament, he knew he wouldn't be able to get away with what he was planning to do. Now, as I noted earlier on, there are no large organizations in the modern world that are non-bureaucratic. There are organizations that more accurately and less accurately reflect the bureaucratic ideal, but there are none that are non-bureaucratic, and that goes for states too, right? The only non-bureaucratic states are dysfunctional ones, ones that are failed. It's also not an attractive idea to talk about abolishing bureaucracy or democracy, right? So, whether we like it or not, we're stuck with bureaucratic public services and state organizations, and we really would like to keep democracy. So, democratic politicians and their bureaucrats have to find a way to work together. And that daily struggle between technical expertise and political understandings of what is good is a creative tension that must be managed. And the person in charge of managing it is the minister. Now, a key variant from the Weber ideal type is the degree to which bureaucracy is fragmented. Basically, when somebody says to me, what does the Canadian bureaucracy think of and pick an issue? I often reply to them which part, because depending on what department somebody works in, they might have a very different view of an issue. The opinions of the people in Indigenous affairs is often very different than the opinion of people in natural resources. The opinion of, and here's a classic one we've all heard of and know, the opinion of a political international issue that's held by the Department of Global Affairs, our foreign ministry, is probably pretty different than the opinion that's held of it by the Department of National Defense. Right? Diplomats and generals tend to see the world differently. And to the extent specialists in different ministries or departments work alongside one another but have different interests, these bureaucrats also tend to see their department's interests as being aligned with those views and stakeholders, right? So it's not surprising that our diplomats tend to have views that are aligned with the diplomats from other countries and the non governmental organizations with an interest in diplomatic work. Meanwhile, the generals tend to have views that are aligned with the generals from our NATO allies and with the various non governmental organizations with an interest in national security and the various firms that make weapons. So, this division, this natural division along specializations and ministries, gives the elected leaders a bit of freedom from that first problem, the problem that bureaucracies concentrate knowledge in the hands of the senior public servants. Because the cabinet, the collective group headed by our prime minister and comprised of the prime minister's ministers, have a bit of leeway as to which set of bureaucrats they listen to. We may be facing a major international challenge, and the bureaucrats who work in foreign affairs, global affairs, the diplomats, may have one view of how to handle the situation. The bureaucrats at Department of National Defense, the generals, may have a different view. The people who specialize in international development may have a third view, and the people who work in promoting international trade and economic activity in the finance department might have a fourth view of the same issue. Consequently, conflict in politics and public policy making is often not between society and the bureaucratic state, but between factions of the bureaucratic state and their clients in society, and other factions of the bureaucratic state and their clients from society. And this gives the politicians a bit of leeway from that first problem we mentioned about bureaucracy when we talked about the power of knowledge, because there might be rival plans emerging in the bureaucracy on many issues. However, that pluralism of opinions and interests that's often found in bureaucracy also creates another problem, so called overload. With bureaucracy attentive to different interests in society, public sector bureaucracies might become unresponsive to the main direction political leaders wish to follow. In fact, it might even be hard for these leaders to set a main direction. So the government, the cabinet headed by the prime minister, might have a key priority. We want to get the deficit under control. The problem is that might not be the key priority of every section within the bureaucracy. And to the extent the cabinet cannot get the bureaucracy to make it their priority, the government is going to fail in realizing its key priority. So the government may achieve a lot of things, but none of them might be its key priority. Now, before moving on, we need to talk about also the subsidiary roles of bureaucracy. These are not things that bureaucracy was designed to do, but they are things that research has shown it does accomplish. First is so-called representative bureaucracy. This is the idea that bureaucratic jobs tend to be pretty good. And to the extent the bureaucracy is representative of the people it serves, they serve as role models for them. Second, to the extent bureaucracy is representative of the people it serves, it also ensures that those opinions have a better chance of being incorporated into public debate. So it's not surprising that, for example, when the tax system was created and the first sales taxes were created, certain products were exempted because they were seen as essential for daily life. But one of the categories of products that was initially not exempted from sales tax were feminine hygiene products. The various paper and fabric and cloth products that women use to protect their clothes when they're having their menstrual cycle. Surprise, surprise, the overwhelmingly male senior ranks of the public service didn't think those were essential products. Guess what? Now that there's a closer balance of genders in the mid to senior ranks of the public servants, they are considered essential products. A silly, but perhaps accurate example of how a representative bureaucracy changes policy. Second, bureaucracy, because it requires procedures to be followed, provides a predictable means of government and therefore transparency that enhances democracy. We know that for bureaucrats to take a decision, they have to follow certain steps. So we can monitor those steps to ensure that nothing of interest to us is happening. So, for instance, interest groups will pay attention because they know that in order to make regulations, government has to post drafts of them 90 days before they're finalized. Let's give an example. So they'll pay attention and monitor that government website, right? Because they know that any regulations that might affect their members are going to have to be posted there, right? So when people follow a set procedure, it enhances transparency, and that's good for democracy. Now, I've already argued that bureaucracy is best seen as an ideal type that real world organizations approximate but don't really perfectly mimic. During the 80s and 90s, government spent a lot of time and effort trying to modify the bureaucratic model to better address some of those weaknesses we have noted and discussed. Three specific problems tended to worry political leaders and the senior bureaucrats that advised them. The first was that the emphasis bureaucracy placed on accountability tended to reduce efficiency by stifling innovation. Tied to that, this tended to be because bureaucracy tended to be somewhat inflexible. And what all of this meant, when put together with the power of knowledge and the fact that bureaucracies tend to cater to specific clients that work alongside their ministries, that bureaucracies were somewhat unresponsive to the general direction set by political leaders of the state. Right? They tend to be efficient because there isn't much in it. It's hard to be innovative in a bureaucracy. Uh, they tend to be a bit inflexible. They don't change easily. And they tend to develop interests according to their specialization and the issues they deal with and the clients they deal with. And that makes them unresponsive to the general direction set by political leaders. And all of that is, well, that's what you get. The problem is in the 80s and 90s, the world was changing. Politicians found themselves trying to set new directions. The general directions of policies that had been set at the end of World War II no longer fit the world around them. Technology was changing, communication was changing, people, the very people in Canada were changing. If you think about it, the average Canadian at the end of World War II had a high school education, hadn't graduated from high school, but had had a bit of it. Now we're getting very close to the point where roughly half of Canadian adults have some form of education beyond high school. That's a big change. That increase in education, that increase in education makes people feel differently about government and want different things. The changing world around us with AI, the internet, telecommunications, all of these things, computing, are just beginning to have an impact. We don't know where they're going. What we do know is there's going to be a lot of change. And that really, and people began to realize this 40 years ago, that the world was changing, right in the 80s. And the change has just gotten faster and faster and faster ever since. And those problems we noted about the bureaucratic model make it a little awkward in that situation, a little behind the times. It's not that we need to get rid of bureaucracy, but we need to modify it. And the Olson article discusses the modifications attempted according to one approach called the new public management. And the basic idea of the new public management is to reduce process accountability and put more effort and emphasis on results or outcome accountability so as to enhance both efficiency and responsiveness to changes in public policy direction made by elected officials. So we're going to focus not so much on doing things according to a correct process and put more emphasis on getting the correct answer, on getting results, on achieving the goal. And the way this is done under the new public management is by specifying, having the minister in charge, the elected official, specify what public servants and public agencies are expected to achieve, but then giving the senior public servants more latitude and freedom in deciding how to do it. Second, the new public management seeks to use monetary incentives to back this up. So not only do they specify what public servants and public agencies are expected to achieve, but they specify in employment contracts with the senior public servants what will happen if they meet certain criteria. Essentially, their pay is now tied to a certain extent to how well they meet the goals set by their minister. Third, wherever possible, public servants are encouraged to use contracts to assign work rather than hierarchy and to make those contracts competitive. So rather than, for example, having a Department of Transport and a division that cleans the roads, what we'll have is a Department of Transport and a division that's responsible for contracting road cleaning and snow removal. rather than a group of people who perform cleaning and snow removal and are directed by our hierarchy in the Department of Transport. We're going to have a group of officials who place tenders and call for bids among the various companies qualified to do the work. So the relationship between the department and the services it provides is now a contractual relationship rather than one of command and control through hierarchy. And wherever possible, the new public management encourages managers to use contracts that are competitively awarded rather than hierarchies to find the people to do what needs to be done, to find the organizations to do what needs to be done. And this has strengths and this has weaknesses like anything else. Not going to talk too much about them now because they'll come up later. We're going to spend a lot of time actually talking about it over the next few weeks. What we can say is that since the millennium, governments have been thinking and rethinking whether or not this new public management has been such a good idea. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Thank you so much. Hope you have a good day.